Welcome to Day 2 of the 10th Deleuze and Guattari Studies in Asia Conference. I hope you will enjoy the restful evening and are ready for another day filled with stimulating discussions. We're excited to kick off today's program with our first keynote speech titled The Cybernetic Order Word, Information, Technicity, and Enaction. Our speaker for this session is Professor Chantelle. The session will be chaired by Professor Chun-yen Chen from the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at National Taiwan University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gray and Professor Chen.
So welcome to keynote number 5 of this conference. My name is Chen-yen Chen, and it's such a privilege to be here introducing our speaker, Professor Chantelle Gray, coming all the way from South Africa. Professor Gray is a philosopher teaching at Northwest University in South Africa. She received her PhD in philosophy from the University of Stellenbosch. But actually, I found out that she actually majored in English literature and linguistics as an undergrad. Professor Gray specializes in continental philosophy with a focus on Deleuze and Guattari, obviously. But her research interests also include political theory, queer theory, gender studies, as well as African and Caribbean philosophies. She's the author of Anarchism After Deleuze and Guattari, Fabulating Futures, published in 2022. I had actually the chance to listen to a podcast interview where she talked about how her interest in anarchism came about, and apparently it was when she was taking a short break from academia when she opened a vegan restaurant, where she met someone working in anarchism. So aside from the book, she's very, very productive. She has published an incredible number of journal articles, book chapters. She's also co-editor of the collection Deleuze and Anarchism. And more recently, she has been devoted to critical algorithm studies and has written extensively on the subject. Her talk today is titled The Cybernetic Order Word, Information, Technicity, in Action. And in the abstract, she says that she looks to account for a philosophy adequate to the digital age, something we shall be looking forward to. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chantelle Gray.
I think it's okay. Thank you so much for that introduction, and I don't see Professor Sebastian, but I'm just going to thank him anyway for inviting me. Okay, so some of you may be old enough to remember The Usual Suspects, a film centered on the interrogation of Roger Verbal Kint, one of 2 criminals who survived a bloody massacre on a ship after a botched drug deal. Just 6 weeks earlier, Verbal and 3 of his fellow criminals had been arrested as suspects in a hijacking incident. So it comes as no surprise that Agent Dave Coogan is loath to accept any innocence on Verbal's part, even as he assumes Verbal an easier target than the other arrested person because of his limp. By the end, based on Verbal's account, Agent Coogan draws the conclusion that the phantom ship killer, currently known as Kaiser Soze, is actually the notorious drug dealer D. Keaton, who was trying to fake his own death. With no evidence to hold Verbal any longer, bail is posted and he is released. As he walks out of the police station, Verbal loses his uneven gait, and just as Agent Coogan comes to the shocking realization that he had been tricked. Verbal had pieced together his stories from random item and news clippings in sight. The penny drops. Verbal is Soze. At this point, a voiceover plays. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. And like that, he's gone. LLMs, or large language models, have recently played a similar hoax on the world. Of course, the analogy isn't perfect, but you get the point. We haven't yet realized it, and when we do, it will be too late. A similar stunt was pulled during the cognitive revolution of the 1930s, when the world became convinced that brains were really like computers. This idea, which was driven in no small way by branches of linguistics, psychology, and analytic philosophy and information theory, basically equated meaning-making to information processing, which is to say that cognitivists understood computers to provide a mechanical model of thought, just as thought was assumed to consist of physical, symbolic computations. The innovation in logic and information would, by the 1940s, become formalized under the rubric of cybernetics, which had been emerging for some time before it had a proper name, with many ideas taking shape at what would become known as the Macy Conferences. The trans and interdisciplinary nature of cybernetics gave it wide portability and application potential, leading Marshall McLuhan to later argue that it had produced a cybernetic world, by which he meant not only that it propagated patterns of automation and feedback into society, but also that it offered a vocabulary that was both scientific and experimental, rendering it useful to academics and artists alike. More broadly, cybernetics offered a means to frame the ambiguities, anxieties, and potentials inherent in issues pertaining to control and complexity in the relationship between humans, machines, and the environment, as Christina Dunbar Hester puts it. This was post-World War II, so makes sense. But before the emergence of either information theory or cybernetics proper, the study of language and communication had largely been founded on Saussure's understanding of communication as the transmission and exchange of meaning between a sender and a receiver, an idea which would, about 4 decades later, be reflected in the standard transmission model of communication conceived of by none other than the cybernetician Claude Shannon. In his model, however, communication is encountered as an engineering problem, and because meaning is slippery, a matter of social convention and contextually bound interpretation, it was replaced with the notion of information, which Shannon understood in strictly quantitative terms as a procedure by which entropy is measured. Now, although cyberneticians continue to argue about the exact meaning about information, the point, as Matthew Crickard says, is that these non-symbolic, physicalist understandings presented a new ontology of information, inseparable from the material discursive configurations from which they unfolded, as well as the epistemological assumptions they operationalized in the world. Although there are clearly links between Saussure and cybernetics, it is perhaps known Chomsky's more rigorous articulation of the equivalence between language, communication, and code that needs recounting. In his book, The Cultural Logic of Computation, David Galupia argues that the main problem with Chomsky's linguistic model is that far from being a theory of linguistics, what he gave to us was the description of a machine, which established several equivalences between syntax and logical formalisms, between grammar and computer programs, and between the information contained in programmable and abstracted grammatical categories and the information contained in systems of human language, pragmatic human language, pragmatically used. So for him, information is both the deep preset system, was what he called deep grammar, in the human mind that makes language possible, and the algorithmic processes that make the system run. Perhaps even more significant is that in Chomskyan linguistics, which became the new standard model and to some extent still is, to a large extent in fact, any study of performance or language outside the study of syntactical relations was not considered the study of language at all, so pragmatics didn't matter. From this perspective, linguistics is fundamentally a form of cognitive science in that its focus is not on meaning, but on encoding, which leaves very little room for any understanding of dynamic processes. Luciani Floridi argues correspondingly that the information processing view of cognition, intelligence, and mind provides the oldest and best known cluster of significant problems in the philosophy of information, with one of its effects being the reduction of our mental life to little more than an epiphenomenon, with the notion that we have any sense of agency in our lives having been replaced by the image of a quasi-automaton made up of various representational and functional units. Now, in the 1970s, Chomsky's abstract model of linguistics came under scrutiny when people like Rafael Nunez, George Lakoff, and Mark Johnson produced seminal works positing more embodied positions, not only to the abstract thought of mathematics and linguistics, but to cognition more broadly, with similar developments taking place in related fields like philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and artificial intelligence. Based on then developments in cognitive neuroscience, which confirmed views that meaning is in fact grounded in our sensory motor experience, that it's embodied, Lakoff and Johnson argued that this embodied meaning is extended via imaginative mechanisms such as conceptual metaphor, metonymy, radial categories, and various forms of conceptual blending to shape abstract conceptualization and reasoning. Cognitive linguists understood language not only as embodied, but also as congruent to other cognitive functions, and in fact as interacting with other cognitive functions rather than being strongly modular, which was what Chomsky thought based on Jerry Fodor's theorization, and as reflective of cognitive structures. As Lakoff says, because it is assumed that linguistic categories function much the same way as any other conceptual category, any claims made about the nature of linguistic categories should contribute to our understanding of cognition in general. Think, for example, of how we describe our relationships, like romantic relationships, in terms of a long and bumpy road, as being at a crossroads, as off the track, or on the rocks, and so on. So these, as Lakoff argues, are ordinary, everyday English expressions. They are not poetic, nor are they necessarily used for special rhetorical effect. So they're not literary metaphors, they're conceptual metaphors. And so this led him to ask why we would think of love in terms of journeys. And his answer is that our embodied experience of journeying over the ages shapes both our conceptual and semantic structures. In other words, conceptual metaphors are motivated by embodied experiences coming together regularly. But despite this movement away from abstract grammar, cognitive linguists continue, to this day, to insist on representationalism. The problem, as Deleuze and Guattari might state it, is that their theory is not abstract enough, because it fails to reach the abstract machine that connects to language, fails to connect language to the semantic and pragmatic contents of a statement, to collective assemblages of enunciation, and to a whole micropolitics of the social field. Now, besides the abstract machine problem, Deleuze and Guattari argue, as you would all know, that the elementary unit of language is not the statement, but the order word. That is, relations of redundancy. So, to be clear, most working systems rely on a huge amount of redundancy for their functioning. As Raymond Rouillère points out, the seemingly miraculous powers of the brain would not be so conceived if it was not based on the enormous redundancy of its innumerable neuronal connections. So the problem for Rouillère is not redundancy per se, but rather the mechanist postulates of cybernetics, according to which living organisms are reduced to little more than organic information machines, a kind of quantitative organic information machine. So Deleuze and Guattari, likewise, are not concerned with redundancy as such. A refrain, after all, is a redundancy, which in its positive iteration produces something homely to hold on to. The problem of redundancy for them, as it relates to linguistics, is twofold, which they describe as the signifiance of information or frequency and the subjectivity of communication or resonance. Now, frequency should be understood here as indicative of language consisting in valenced rhythms of information and redundancy, by which a code and ability are articulated. In other words, language, which traverses the strata, is connected to heterogeneous regimes of signs, though it can, under specific conditions, be brought into a homogenizing overcoding resonance. So just as when you play a piano and you play a C and a G together, it's got a nice harmonizing resonant sound, so language can be brought into a kind of resonance with different regimes, whether that's with the state, with education, so on. In such cases, language does not serve to streamline the transmission of information, but to ensure that information is not transmitted so that something else can be conveyed in its place. The dogmatic image of thought, the microfascism, the face. All of which lock the organism into the articulated organization of the signified and the signifier, such that it has a future but no becoming, as Deleuze and Guattari put it. So resonance, for its part, ensures that statements are individuated as indirect discourse at the same time as the subject of enunciation is individuated via various incorporeal transformations. More broadly, what Deleuze and Guattari are arguing is that bodily and social organs are continually reinvested in the semiotic systems of artificial organs or assemblages and the morphodynamics of their signs, which determine the identities of ensuing expressions and content, either as differential or as redundant. Another way of thinking about it is that linguistic precursors dramatize passwords, which positively are a recasting of order words in that they denote a word or phrase which can create passage or leakage into a creative regime. In the postscript on the societies of control, Deleuze uses the notion of passwords in a different sense, this time in relation to digital codes, noting that they mark access to information by which, as we know, individuals are rendered individuals, and we're already aware of ourselves as individuals, masses, samples, data, markets, facts. Although he does not make a link to order words here, it seems to me that there is in fact a connection between the grammar of digital passwords and that of order words, in that both implicate a condition of truth involving a certain resonance. Just as watchwords regulated disciplinary societies by bringing the state form into resonance with school form, hospital form, carceral form, and so on, we find in the societies of control that passwords bring codes into resonance with individuals. What this means, in short, is that the system cannot account for either the heterogenetic morphodynamics of language, nor for the differential ontogenetic dynamics of subjectivity, because its basin of attraction is a single, universal, and uniform deep structure by which the entire dynamical system of individuation is rendered a categorizing device whose distributions are determined in advance by the a priori structures they assume. So here is my thesis. Just as the technical development of language moved symbolization beyond the exchange of meaning to the creation of an apparatus of capture, or the order word, so LLMs are cybernetic order words par excellence. Now the problem, as Yokoi has argued, is that digital objects now constitute a ubiquitous milieu from which we cannot escape. Because far from being simply bits and bytes, they are logical statements that form part of the technical system we currently find ourselves in, and thus comprise a world whose foundation is formal and logical. Because technological systems are based on the control of signals, like the control voltage levels of logic gates, for example, and signs, binary codes, that are more efficient than symbolic mediations, a kind of symbolic misery is produced, whereby individuals or groups are robbed of the opportunity to participate in aesthetic existence, in turn inducing further libidinal misery, apathy, boredom, anomie, and oppressive hedonia, to name a few. One source of this melancholia is the exteriorization of collective memory, which Bernard Stiegler has theorized extensively, though it was the anthropologist André Leroy-Gourhan, sorry for that pronunciation, who in Gesture and Speech first put forward a number of arguments concerning the exteriorization of memory and the parallel processes of the freeing of the organs via language, tools, and technologies, as well as the interiorization of milieus by the organism. So as we exteriorize our memory into tools and processes, machines, for example, these days are cell phones, they take on a life of their own and they start reorganizing our environments, which we then re-internalize to adapt to them, and then we create new technologies and so on. Drawing on Leroy-Gourhan, Stigler reformulates the problem of memory in terms of 3 levels. The first of which is phylogenetics, or species-related memory, which is largely transspecialized via the genomic phylum. The second, or societal level, deals with the problem of operational memory, which Stigler reformulates as epigenetics. Related is the issue of language, since the construction, transmission, and preservation of individual memory is channeled through cultural knowledges like myths and rituals. But to compensate for the retentional finitude of individual memory, organisms have to exteriorize part of themselves to ensure the transgenerational transmission of knowledges, because we can't remember everything. So this found initial expression in the creation of artificial tools, thereby extending techniques outside the scope of zoological realities, at once rendering social memory via the exteriorization of individual memory capable both of adding to itself at a rapid rate and extending its temporal duration by means other than linguistic and ritualistic symbolism and action. When language became externalized through the use of writing, it was placed on the same level as techniques, not because oralism excludes a graphism, but because non-status societies with oral traditions had a geo-graphism. That's what Deleuze and Guattari call it. Meaning their methods of social inscription were characterized by physical markings like tattoos, brandings, and scarifications, or the wearing of masks and the performance of rituals to ensure the auto-reproduction of their social or collective memory. Now, Deleuze and Guattari call this kind of graphism territorial precisely because it is grounded in the collective investment of desire and a shared creation of norms, myths, codes of conduct, and so on. In their words, savage formations are oral, are vocal, but not because they lack a graphic system. A dance on the earth, a drawing on the wall, a mark on the body are graphic systems, a geographism, a geography. With writing, there is a movement towards a stricter linearization of symbols, such that the alphabet is more than just a means of committing to memory the progressive acquisitions of the human mind. It is a tool whereby a mental symbol can be noted in both word and gesture by a single process. So Stigler, building on Derrida's work, understands this linearization as grammatization, or the mnemotechnical articulation of experience via verbal and gestural rituals of remembrance, the use of tools, including tools for writing, and further developments in techniques and technologies, by which both individual and collective experience and memory become transmissible across space and time. Art can also do this, of course. So mnemotechnics, in other words, are not only memory supports or extensions, but forms of memory that are constitutive of human experience in an intrinsic and essential way. So even though it is a non-genetic memory, which is exterior to the living organism, qua individual, supported by the non-zoological collective organization of objects, it nevertheless functions and evolves as a quasi-biological milieu. So this exteriorized memory, which Stigler calls tertiary retention, forms a recursive circuit with what Husserl called primary and secondary retention. So the processing of incoming information and making sense of it, which also constitutes the digital technical system. So that the soul is no longer simply a movement that returns to itself, to determine itself, but rather the soul whose noetic activity is also a technesis. So as we exteriorize our memory, it is not only a biological action, it is also a technical action. But what this means is that trans-individuation now also relies on this third memory. So if we think of cell phones and the way in which Stigler says we dump our memories in there without ever using it, it takes on a life on its own nevertheless, and it becomes part of our constitutive, it partly constitutes our experience. So for Stigler, digital tertiary retention, which also constitutes the digital technical system, is disruptive precisely because it takes control of our shared potential capacities by increasing disindividuating individuals. But here lies the paradox, because while technical memory or tertiary retention is the necessary condition for the regulation and organization of a society, epiphylogenesis constitutes a genuine break with life, which in turn forms the very ideal of a mythesis universalis, with LLMs being just the latest innovation paradigmatic of this form of desymbolization. That being said, what makes them qualitatively different is that they replace trans-individuation, or individuation between the I and the we, with what Simondon calls inter-individuation. Simondon writes, to the extent that the inter-individual relation offers a prior validation of the ego grasped as a persona through the functional representation that others have formed of it, this relation avoids the acuteness of the calling into question of oneself by oneself. On the contrary, the veritable trans-individual relation only begins beyond solitude. It is constituted by the individual who calls himself into question and not by the convergent sum of inter-individual rapports. Psychical individuation, in other words, must be polarized, must have an asymmetrical relation between the subject that calls itself into question and the trans-individual relation, which is the very requirement for a subject having the capacity to question itself. Because this calling into question is already begun by others. The decentering of the subject relative to itself is carried out in part by others in the inter-individual relation, but only to the extent that the trans-individual relation, the relation between the individual and society, is not obscured by the inter-individual relation. In the case that it does obscure the trans-individual relation, the individual can no longer be extended by that relation, meaning a devitalization of the organism's rhythms of being has taken place, which would then lead to nothing but an interiority and not a spirituality, Stigler puts it, which is what Deleuze and Guattari mean by a future with no becoming. Now, Stigler's grammatization, like Deleuze and Guattari's graphism, presents a technical problem as much as it does an immunological one, because each stage of grammatization produces a disorientation in need of processes of integration and metastabilization. So every time a new technology comes about, there is a disequilibration in society, and we have to find ways to respond to it. So you can think, for example, during the Industrial Revolution, families were broken up and people started fighting for the 8-hour working day. And that was a way to find new equilibration. So Georges Cuvier, trained in both medicine and philosophy, became interested in developing a general method for thinking about how organisms tend to perturbations in their milieus, which he did with reference to the normal and the pathological, where normativity indicates for him a knowledge of life, or an organism's sensitivity to its milieus, which themselves provide a context-sensitive scaffolding of vital norms for the organism to interpret, the same way as for Deleuze and Guattari, a symptom has to be interpreted. So he's talking about vital norms, not social norms here. A pathological state thus indicates the depreciation of a norm insofar as the organism is prevented from participating actively and comfortably in the kind of life previously belonging to it and still largely enjoyed by others. Pathology, before it becomes a disease or monstrous formation, is thus nothing but an agitation which provides information to the organism about the norms of life in its milieus. Knowledge, accordingly, is both a technique for harmonizing tensions arising from the activity of living and that which is produced in the process. As such, it is constitutive of our immunological commons, in that recurrent patterns of activity are quasi-causal of normativities, not as final resolutions to any given problem, but as processes of equilibration. Recent work on inaction understands this normative condition as one of three requirements for agency, with self-individuation and interactional asymmetry being the other two. As sensory motor agents, we are continually involved in meaningful activities consisting in the coordination of dynamic processes at various scales in response to perturbations in our bodies and environments. These disturbances produce interactional asymmetries or sensory motor contingencies that require equilibration, what Simondon and Schlegel might call individuation and transindividuation. But equilibration requires adaptive mechanisms by which an organism or system can extend or modify its current repertoire of sensory motor schemes. Now, important for inactivists is that equilibration is neither functionalist nor representationalist, and this is why I think their theory is so important. For me, it is what they have done is made visible what Deleuze and Guattari mean by becoming. So the way in which they describe inaction or how we participate in the world and even in language, as we'll see, is from moment to moment. It's not representational. It's about acting and responding to these perturbations, making sense of them for ourselves and together. So important for inactivists is that equilibration is neither functionalist or representationalist. Instead, they understand it to be a sense-making capacity, involving, as Ezekiel Di Paolo and his colleagues argue, sensitivities and efficacies as co-defined pairs in adaptive regulation, not wholly unlike Deleuze and Guattari's understanding of consistency as the intrinsic normativity, or refrain, produced by anxieties, affects, and subjectless individuations. To put it differently, equilibration is the result and production of knowledge of life, understood in this context as behavioral genres and activity clusters by which micro-worlds or realms of significance are produced. Each of these regulatory acts contributes to the know-how of the organism, just as the recursive use of social acts creates a powerful way of handling more complex dynamics, both of which can be extended over various timescales, just as they can take the form of thresholds that should not be crossed. For example, blood sugar levels in mammals. So the key insight of inactivism, besides that it's non-representational, is that it conceives of mental life as the ongoing meaningful engagement between precariously constituted embodied agents and the worlds of significance they bring forth in their asserting activity. Now, social cognition, which includes interpersonal coordination, involves, according to Di Paolo, the experiential structures of moment-to-moment participation with other bodies, which cannot solely be derived from organic and sensory motor experiences. Coordination in this context refers both to the sustained coupling between two or more systems and the entrainment of rhythmic patterns across different spatial and temporal scales. Sounds very Deleuzean. Sense-making, as an enacted and shared practice, implies that it is perturbed, enabled, modulated, regulated, or even constituted by what goes on in the interaction. Progressively, and through mutual equilibration and the establishment of enabling relations or vital norms then, a local but precarious pragmatics emerges, which in Deleuze and Guattari's work is theorized as the body of organs, without organs, which requires careful or then immunological experimentation so as not to botch it. I would argue, in fact, that the body without organ is the immunological concept in Deleuze and Guattari's work, even though, as with all their concepts, it should be understood as part of a constellation rather than as a cut of unit. One form of participatory sense-making, though of course by no means the only or most important, is language. So while it has been established that language is embodied, there have, until fairly recently, been no convincing accounts of the opposite, namely that bodies are linguistic. Now, according to the enactivist thesis, linguistic bodies are self-contradictory social products and personal achievements that sustain displaced relationships to themselves, commit to choices, and abide in the coupling flows of self and other directed utterances. Because social significance, like individual vital normativity, requires an asymmetry, a joint enactment of frame building is called for. So the result is what De Paulo, Elena Cafari, and Hannah de Jager refer to as the braiding of utterances, which must be mutually relevant for the participation genre and the emerging frame of a specific dialogue. And so what I like about this idea of the braiding of utterances is that it really brings it's really the opposite of what happens on social media, which lends itself to hyperbole and fast responses, and nothing that really builds society. And of course I'm being hyperbolic here because, for example, during COVID, for example, there were spaces for trans people online that were really helpful. But again, on those spaces, there is what I would call braiding of utterances rather than crazy feedback. So when bodies participate in acts of languaging, they are re-establishing the molar aggregates of language as much as they are redirecting, re-signifying, vitalizing, molecularizing, and sculpting living languages in ways that cannot be fully determined nor fully predicted by the capacities, intentions, and experiences brought to the encounter, nor by the broader constraints of social norms, environmental situations, or even grammar rules. To language is thus to individuate and trans-individuate power centers, technical social machines, regimes of science, and semiotic collective machines, while being individuated by these at the same time. It is not simply an algorithmically determined statistical aggregate of possible word and sentence clusters, as we find with LLMs. Rather, it is about symbolization, so trans-individuation or collective meaning-making, through normative adoption, which in turn makes possible aesthetic individuation. This is because the braiding of utterances provides a practical means for the transduction of time. In other words, through the braiding of utterances, or collective meaning-making, the present becomes a transduction between the field of the future and the interconnected points of the past, such that the individual and collective protension, or future projection, what might even be called dreaming, becomes possible. What ChatGPT and its counterparts deprive us of is precisely this process of braiding, because being faster, it not only appeals to a cynical, overworked populace who have long lost time for taking care of our shared immunological commons, as we also saw during COVID, but also to a large extent substitutes the trans-individual with the inter-individual. When this takes place, the braiding of utterances is replaced by the cybernetic order word, which turns creative passwords into coded ones, the numerical language of control, whose passive danger is jamming, and whose active one is piracy and the introduction of viruses, as Deleuze writes. These viruses, far from being merely types of malicious software and malware, make up the set of relations by which our vital norms are not only perturbed, but transformed into monstrous and overly redundant formations. As Kangulin argues, it is with medicine as with all other technologies. It is an activity rooted in the living being's spontaneous effort to interpret the science in its environment and integrate it in such a way that vital normativity is regained. In conclusion then, it seems to me that Deleuze and Guattari's symptomatology of language is more prescient today than when they wrote it, precisely because it is so tied to the problem of epiphylogenetics and the immunological conditions it establishes, conditions which are disrupting our capacities to dream together. Faced with these devitalized normativities, how can philosophy respond in a manner that is adequate to life? Big question. It seems hardly worth it sometimes, given the vast amounts of capital being invested in the destruction of life. Instead of being passive bystanders, perhaps it is time to consider the notion of hacking, a worthwhile philosophical one. To be sure, hacking is productive and destructive. And, as Mackenzie Walker's argued, if you're not part of the new bourgeoisie, which she names the vectorialist classes, characterized by their monopoly on the vectors of information, you are a hacker or part of the hacking classes, because you hack wittingly or unwittingly when you have a social media profile, a smartphone, or access to the internet. But what if we hacked back? It's not a panacea, I know, but as an inactive process, hacking creates different conditions for the braiding of utterances and the establishment of vital norms. I'm thinking of hacker spaces coming together and learning to hack together. The establishment of vital norms, that is knowledge of life. So hacking, as the digital equivalent to Deleuze and Guattari's concept of stuttering, is the enactment of molar and molecular action-based processes of sense-making that are world-involving rather than representational. The reality is that LLMs are inactive participants in our precarious, individuative ecologies. And because we are enacting novel habits with them, we are establishing new vital or devitalized norms as part of more complex activities that necessitate various relations between several kinds of schemes. The point of hacking, in the epoch of negative protension, as Stigler calls it, where there's no dreaming, in other words, there's no future projection, is through new methods for the braiding of utterances to create conditions in which the present can once again become a transduction between future and the past, to make possible the collective dreaming into being of a viable future. As Razor says in the 1994 Hackers, remember, hacking is more than just a crime. It's a survival trait. Thank you.
Thanks to our speaker for this really timely engagement. And I happen to come from media theory and the theory of cultural techniques, so I have actually a lot of questions. But I think the privilege of making comments should be with the audience. So we have about 20 minutes. For the sake of our staff doing the transcription, please tell us who you are before you fire away with your questions.
My name is Yaron Caspi, and I'm working here in the NTU. And I have two questions for you. So you start by in a way contracting between making a contradiction between the representational way of thinking about the way that the brain works and the non-representational way of an activism. Now, today one of the main theory of how the brain works is the predictive coding, and specifically the free energy principle. Now, they are based on the notion of Shannon, which you try to present as the essence of the representational way. Moreover, one of the main supporters of this theme in the philosophy of mind is Andy Clark, which is one of the big supporter of activism. So the point over here is that it's much more, I'm not sure that there is a contradiction between the two. Maybe they work together. Maybe there is no, we have to think about it more as something that is both representational and maybe sometimes non-representational, or have two-sided. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that Varela, that you didn't mention in the lecture but was in the abstract, was one of, and that brought an activism to the cognitive sciences. He thought about the way of making cognitive science as a project of reviving phenomenology. So I would like you to talk a little bit more about this connection between phenomenology and the concept of that you raised.
Thank you. So Varela, in fact, is, I didn't talk about it because it's too long, it's in the paper. So Varela is, of course, the link between the earlier ideas of how cognition works, which is the brain as a computer, and where we get to enactivism. So you're right about that. So for Varela, what happened is, well, he and Evan Thompson worked together, and they really started thinking about a different way of thinking about cognition. And so, in fact, the embodied mind is badly, it's a bad title because it should be in the inactive mind, because they already propose it there. And so the thing with Varela is he does want to bring a more phenomenological account. So he wants to move away from representation. He wants to move away from this idea that cognition at its base level is representational. Now, of course, representation does happen at some point. So, for example, there is a representation when we're talking about concepts and how they relate to things. But for him, this is, and for an activist, this is later. This is not at the level at which cognition happens at base. Okay, and so that's the theory that I really am interested in, because Deleuze and Guattari talk about getting away from representation all the time, but they don't give us a very particular view of how that might work in cognition. And so I think the enactivist view currently presents the best way, the most convincing way, which is very Deleuzian and very Guattarian, about thinking a non-representational consciousness. And so Andy Clark is interesting because he does, of course, talk about the extended mind, but he also does remain functionalist in that he remains representational. And so for me, that is where he and Chalmers fall flat. So what I like about their theory, which is different from a lot of other analytic philosophy, is that they take language and cognition, at least, into the world. And so it's not just about propositions. So I give them credit for that. But I think at base, they remain representational. And I think, one of the things that Di Paolo talks about is the stickiness of representationalism and the stickiness of this idea that the brain is a computer. And it's so easy to think about it because now it's evolved, right? The computer has evolved. So now we can think about new ways of thinking about the brain as a computer. But it's this representation of what cognition is. And so what I like about what I find convincing about their theory is that they really think about how our neuronal structures and our experience responds immediately rather than already once we've thought about it. And so just on the free energy principle, so I've sort of come full circle with that thing, because in the beginning I thought, oh, this is a smart theory. And it represented a kind of update almost for me of Varela's idea of operational closure, when they talk about, like surprise minimization, that kind of thing, right? But again, their model remains statistical. And so it remains quantitative and therefore cannot account for individuation. And that is why I prefer bringing Simondon and so on back into the picture, so that we can think about consciousness more broadly speaking, but cognition also, not only as embodied, but as inactive, in that it is happening all the time, that we are responding to each other, to our environments all the time, from moment to moment, and that is how we learn. That we learn from our sensory motor experience, after which we can think about it and make representations about it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Next. Yes, please. Do we have a...
Hi, Chantelle, thanks. That was really interesting. So I kind of want to speak about this idea of braiding of utterances, because De Paulo, who I'm now interested in, if you could say more how that works. It sounds sort of like Deleuze and Guattari collective, assemblage of enunciation, but maybe it's not. And then also, secondly, you're sort of implying now, you said cybernetic order words sort of interrupt that or change that in some fundamental way because of new technologies. And I wonder if you could say a little more about that relation. It went through quickly, so I know you said it, but if you just sort of summarize it or give it back to me in a
Yes, so the braiding of utterances, so just to get back to language, so, I mean, linguistic theory is very interesting because even the way we teach it remains at the level of like, okay, we're going to teach grammar, we're teaching these structures, this is how it works. It's a very formalized kind of way of making sense of the world. And again, this is already at the representational level. And so the braiding of utterances is a far more embodied in active understanding of how language works, not just as either a deep structure that is already existent and that we just slot into, right? But as this thing that happens as we are exposed to people, to situations. And the reason this makes sense to me is because I have a linguistics background. And thinking about sociolinguistics, if you look at languages, it is so shaped not just by the rules we learned, but by the context that we are exposed to, by the people we are exposed to, by cultural norms. And so all of these things have a direct physical relationship to language. And so the braiding of utterances is an extension of that, in that it takes account not only of language as something that happens with the individual and just as this exchange of meaning. Oh, there's a little message, it's going between us, we have to code and encode it, all of that. But rather, it's something that's messy. They talk about it being messy, precarious. And that's what I love about it. Its meaning can be so interrupted by so many different things, depending on the context, depending on cultures, depending on the way we feel that day. And still, we have to try to trans-individuate together. And so they really take account of the fact that it's not syntactical structures like Chomsky would say. It's not just what happens between words or analytic philosophy in terms of propositions and so on. It's really a kind of messy moment-to-moment experience. And what is interesting for me about that in terms of the cybernetic order word is that, and I think this is Stigler's point also, is that social media is radically changing how we communicate. We communicate in short little spurts. We identify certain things that can be highlighted. We're very hyperbolic. People get so angry with each other on social media. It's wonderful. You can just, they just say things. It just comes out. There's no thought. And this for Stigler is what is interrupting our societies, right? We've lost ways of collectively making meaning, and we're losing it. We're continually losing it. And so for me, this braiding of utterances has really brought into focus a new way of understanding not only how the cybernetic order works, but also how to make sense of this messiness of language and meaning making, and perhaps how we could use it to, if you think about braiding, I always think about braiding when I think about this, I think of the braiding of hair. And for anyone who's ever had long hair, if you make like a French plait yourself, it can be good or bad. It can be really awful. It's a skill. And so the braiding of utterances, as they also say, it's a skill. It's something that we learn continually. And so that's what I like about it.
We have time for more comments. Yes, do it.
Hi, this is Julian from Taiwan, and I'm really impressed by your speech, especially about the part about trans-individuation. I think I have very brief questions about. So, do you think there will be like some kind of limited trans-individuation? Because I think there may be some tension between individuation and trans-individuation. Since by trans-individuation, we're thinking of like an open world, not pre-controlled by codes, by algorithms. But I'm just wondering, if we take the path like as you suggest, but because I'm thinking about issues brought by like system theory. They start with operational closure, autopoiesis, and I know some people would like to challenge that by giving ideas like allopoiesis. So we are not actually created by ourselves, but in our interaction or inaction or couplings with our othering, now we cannot say individual since they are kind of dissolved into this trans-individual thing. But that's something I'm thinking about. Will that be a problem when we are just, very, very much trans-individuated with one another? And do we need some kind of control about this trans-individual thing so that we can still say we still can claim some kind of individuation, if not individuality, right? And I hope the question makes sense. Thank you.
Yes, it does. So for me, autopoiesis remains important. I think we must be able to make sense. For a system to continue living, it must be able to understand its own boundaries. Otherwise, it will either die or it will be absorbed by something else or whatever. So I think that holds for me. I think the way we can think about trans-individuation, if we think about Varela, is through structural coupling. So that is a kind of different way of thinking about trans-individuation. I think the only thing that Simondon brings maybe to the fore is to also think about the pre-individual and not just about the individuated state, which is where Varela remains. Even though I say this, but he has that one article about the meshwork of selfless selves, and for me already he is moving at the end of his life towards somehow thinking about individuation and trans-individuation, the pre-individual. But he doesn't say it. I think he remains in a kind trapped by phenomenology. But he's definitely thinking about it. And so I think both are important. I think again, what is interesting for me about Simondon and also Stigler is when they talk about psychic individuation, and they're talking about the capacity of the individual to call itself into question as being conditioned, really, by the kinds of trans-individuation they allow for themselves or are exposed to, is really interesting because this question of society is a question that lingers for me, and I don't have good answers, except that I think we need to be offline more and be interacting with each other more. That's all I come down to all the time. It's like we need new ways of communing again that isn't just online. And so, I'm not technophobic in that sense. I also like technology. I do lots of things with technology. But I do think, and this is the thing, is that society is changing so fast. And with LLMs and, the kind of, what are their counterparts? The artistic ones and so on. Midjourney. They're smart. Like I was reading this article in the New York Times the other day, and it had 10 little videos, and you had to choose which ones are real and which ones are not. And I was terribly bad at it. I got 5 out of 10. And that's how good it is. And so I keep wondering, like, what will happen, for example, to fake news with these kinds of things, How are we we have to create new kinds of ways of fact-checking. And I think it's too much for one person. So we need to have communities of trust. For example, and this is not related to, but if you think about COVID and the way it was handled, we could have organized this differently. We could have been like, okay, is there a way for us to let each other know in our little communities that someone is sick by WhatsApp, they need food. We can look after each other in different ways without having had all the extreme measures that we had, right? Somebody could have been like, oh, well, this needs to happen today, maybe we can do that. And so I think the same is true for online communities and for individuation and trans-individuation. We need both, but they're so connected.
I'm afraid our time is up. Please join me in thanking our speaker again.